Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar from the Institute of Export and International Trade, looking at initiatives to bolster trade between the UK and Ireland. And why are we doing this webinar? Well, the Republic of Ireland is, of course, a very important trading partner for the UK, with Ireland's Central Statistics Office last week finding that British exports to the country rose by 55% in 2022. However, while this boom may have been at least partially supported by both countries emerging from the worst impacts of the pandemic, Brexit, another major event of the last few years, has probably been less conducive to supporting that trade, as evidenced by a 10% drop in UK exports to Ireland in December 2022 compared to December 21. Traders on both sides of the Irish Sea are continuing to adapt to the new customs controls and requirements that have been introduced since Brexit, and today's webinar will look at some of the initiatives being considered by the British and Irish governments to facilitate a smoother flow of goods. My name is William Barnes-Graham, the Executive Editor at the Institute, and I'll be your host today. But on the next slide, to begin with, it is my delight to welcome Ian Hampton, the Chief Operating Officer at Stena Line, responsible for its fleet of vessels, government affairs, and the safety and security of its onboard crews. Ian has been at Stena for 10 years, having spent his entire career in the shipping and logistics sector, and has been leading the company's journey through Brexit, helping prepare its customers for the changes they've encountered because of it, while influencing and supporting the government on its future border arrangements. Ian is now going to say a few words about today's webinar, Stena's role in facilitating Ireland-UK trade, and some of the solutions we're going to be covering today. So over to you, Ian.
Thank you for that introduction, William, and welcome everyone to this webinar. So Stena is proud of its position in the Irish Sea. We have 11 vessels that operate from GB to the Isle of Ireland, of which we have also 3 ports that we fully own and operate. 2 of those ports are in Wales, which are directly ROI-facing ports. The fleet of vessels that we have has been growing and expanding over time, all broadly in line with our business case, but of course, as William identified, there have been bumps in the road as a result of the effects of Brexit and trade. One of those particularly was the land bridge traffic which operated between Dublin and Holyhead, which was taking cargo from EU across to the Republic of Ireland. So one of our big initiatives that's on the table for us today is turning Holyhead into a free port, which we have great ambition to drive economic growth, not just for the region, but also for the UK economy in general, both linking into sustainability, education, and upskilling of people, creating huge opportunity. But specifically for this webinar, one of the areas of opportunity for us is to strive to bring back some of that land bridge traffic by actually dealing with the complexity of rules that are in place post-Brexit to try and even out the Irish Sea. So striving to bring back that GB ROI trade corridor. Of course, we don't quite yet know the entirety of what will be the Northern Ireland Protocol, what will be contained within it, but we have indication of this green lane principle, which in itself is a positive, but we should not create something that is in effect an imbalance between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. It's most important for us that that central corridor has the facilitations necessary to bring back that trading model that was previously there. As you identified, William, the link between the Republic of Ireland and UK is a very important trading partner. So there is really urgency from our part to establish this free port, which we see as one of the major levers that we can pull, or the UK government can pull, in order to facilitate trade and to open up those trading corridors. And of course, I always remind people whenever I'm on these sort of calls that a lot is within the bequeath of governments, that member states can also look at the Common Customs Code and interpret it in a way that does facilitate trade, and also the Transit Convention. Those are 2 very important pieces of guiding principle for import and export that set the rules. So I always encourage governments and people on the call to test those conventions that are in place, that we maximize flexibility. And that's really what we look for as the bridge over the sea. When we trade to support our customers, we always encourage governments to apply that maximum flexibility. And we've seen some good models, which I'd like to draw our attention to, which is that the Dutch government did when they facilitated trade between Holland and the UK and beyond. So we have a lot of work to do here in understanding how trade moves. And again, I emphasize free ports because if you look at the circuit nature of how trade flows between GB, NI, and ROI, it is a intrinsically linked economic trading zone, and how goods move in that circular motion should never be underestimated. But again, we're proud of our assets that we have. We think we've got room and opportunity here. And as always, I'm trying to do the best with governments to make sure that we do ensure that maximum flexibility. So that's my introduction for you, William, into today's webinar, which I'm excited to continue to listen to input and the rest of the panelists.
Thank you, Ian. Really appreciate that. And some really important points made there, which really do set the context for today's webinar. And thank you. I know you've got a particularly busy schedule today, so thank you for joining us today. But on the next slide, we'll start to introduce some of our other speakers. So first off, in a few moments' time, we'll be hearing from Celine O'Neill, the Head of Brexit and International Policy at Irish Revenue's Customs Division. Celine has been working at Revenue for over 20 years and will be updating us on the customs requirements for post-Brexit trade and some of the latest developments on the EU side. We'll then hear from a real stalwart of the webinar programme in Kevin Shakespeare, the Director of Strategic Projects and International Development at the Institute. Kevin will update you on some of the latest developments on the UK side, including NCTS 5 for transit movements, as discussed just now, Ian mentioning the importance of the land bridge. So that'll be really interesting from Kevin. And after Kevin, it's also a delight to be welcoming back Shankar Singham, the CEO of Trade Law and Economic Policy Consultancy Competare, who will be addressing the potential solutions of digital trade corridors and how they could help with the central corridor just mentioned. But on the next slide, before we do hand over to Celine, we're going to run the first of a few polls we're going to be running throughout this webinar, just asking which of the following trade routes you may have used since Brexit. So Britain to Ireland, Britain to Northern Ireland, Northern Ireland to Ireland, Ireland to the EU via Great Britain, or Ireland to the EU direct. And you can select all that apply. So while you're answering that poll, just some quick housekeeping notes from me. Firstly, you can contact me with any comments or questions using the question panel on the control window, which is usually to the right-hand side of your screen. We hope to get to a number of your questions today, though please note we cannot guarantee we will get to every question in the allocated time. As such, I'll be prioritizing questions that are relevant to the wider audience, so I won't be going into company or sector specific queries as such. And please note that if your questions are short and clear, I am more likely to be able to read them. Finally, you will receive a recording of a webinar with a copy of the slides in a follow-up email we will be sending over the next day or so. So I'll give you just a couple more seconds to answer that poll. Thank you everyone for responding as ever. And I shall close it now. So Kevin, I'll invite you to comment on this poll response in a second, but 88% of the audience are trading along the GB Island routes, which I guess isn't too surprising given the nature of the webinar topic. 71% of you trading between Britain and Northern Ireland, only a quarter doing Northern Ireland to Ireland, so south over the Irish border. 29% of you are using the GB land bridge to some extent, and 22% of you using the Ireland to the EU direct route, which is quite interesting. On the next slide, I'd like to hand over to Celine O'Neill from Revenue to talk about post-Brexit customs requirements and EU developments. And Celine, a particularly significant welcome today because I understand congratulations are in order as Irish Revenue is coming up to its 100th birthday this week. So a huge congratulations for quite a historic landmark. As I hand over to you for your part of the presentation. Over to you, Celine.
Thanks, William, and thanks for having me here to talk to you today. Yes, the anniversary is tomorrow, 100 years since Revenue was formed, and I believe we were one of the first administrations to have a combined tax and customs administration, but I'm reliably informed that was more to do with cost than any far-sighted kind of ideas we had at the time. We couldn't afford to run two separate tax and customs administrations, so it was rolled into one. As the slide says, I'm the head of our Brexit and international policy for Customs Division within Revenue. Been working in Revenue for over 20 years. I'm working on Brexit related issues since 2016. And just on the next slide, I have a few it's important, I think, to set the scene of why we have all of these customs requirements now. So from an EU perspective, it's the EU 27 member states acting as one. There's one customs union, and that means then that all of the goods coming into the EU from outside of the EU, so from any third country, which is now the nature of trade with the United Kingdom since Brexit, all of the goods are checked once on arrival into the EU. Any customs duties or anything like that are collected at that stage. And then the goods can circulate freely through the EU, through the rest of the 27 member states, and they don't have to undergo any more checks, and there's no additional taxes, normally no additional taxes, and definitely no additional duties. And while the traditional role has always been focused on the collection of those duties, the evolving role of customs is now more focused on the things that I've popped up there on the screen. It's to do with product safety, it's to do with supporting legitimate businesses, ensuring safety and security requirements are complied with, the enforcement of prohibitions and restrictions, and the protection of the environment. And just as a bit of context to that, there's one EU piece of customs legislation, the Union Customs Code, as Ian mentioned, but there's about 350 different pieces of sectoral legislation, so legislation to do with product safety, standards, all of that kind of thing, that customs administrations have a role in implementing at our borders. So that's basically summing up why we have all of the requirements we have. If we can move on to the next slide, really what I wanted to talk about was the impact of Brexit that has had on the trade between the United Kingdom and Ireland, bearing in mind why we need all of these formalities that we now have. So the UK is traditionally Ireland's biggest trading partner. Before Brexit, you could break down the trade between Ireland and Great Britain was about 33% of our trade. The other 33% went to the rest of Europe, with the remainder, the remaining 33%, sorry, was to the rest of the world. So all that trade, a third of our trade now, is subject to import and export formalities. And I have import and export formalities because it's not just the customs requirements, it's all of those things I just mentioned, ensuring product safety standards are all adhered to, making sure that safety and security requirements are met, and all of the goods that are imported or exported must be compliant with the UCC and with those other pieces of legislation. Now, we acknowledge that that's particularly challenging given the just-in-time business model that usually operates between the two islands and the large percentage of agri-food products that are traded. And we must bear in mind, I suppose, that the Union Customs Code was developed in 2016 when the UK was a member of the EU. So it's not designed with Brexit in mind, and it's definitely not designed with that just-in-time business model that we see between the two islands. And certainly the land bridge probably was in nobody's mind when all of this was being considered. But I suppose for an Irish perspective, the facilitation of legitimate trade is key. And I think that's been evident in our preparations for Brexit. We had a really strong campaign to educate business and trade on what was going to be required in terms of customs requirements. But also when we were developing our requirements, while we have to enforce the Union Customs Code and the other legislation, how we went about doing that, I think, has been fairly proactive. And we've brought in some new systems, the Customs Ro-Ro service, which hopefully facilitates that free flow of trade. And it has meant then that with the pre-lodgement of customs declarations, we can green route about 92% of all of the trade that arrives in Ireland from ferries, and they're free to leave the port immediately on arrival. So just on the next slide, please. What's next in terms of how do we make it work even better? So obviously the Union Customs Code, as I mentioned, came in 2016. It set out an ambitious IT programme for all member states. Ireland have been to the forefront in introducing our UCC compliant IT programmes, and our first system, the automated import system, went live in November 2020, just in advance of Brexit. This year we'll have our automated export system. Now, it was due to go live last month, but we've deferred it to March just to allow for some more conformity testing. And then the other member states are working on their systems as well, and we'll have more IT developments throughout the remainder of this year and into next year as well. At an EU level, I keep mentioning the Union Customs Code. It is an EU piece of legislation. It applies throughout all 27 member states, but already it's out of date, and it only was implemented in 2016 because, as I said, it didn't take account of Brexit. It didn't take account of the massive increase in e-commerce and online sales, and it's not really fit for purpose already. So the EU have set out a really ambitious customs reform agenda, and they're going to draw on things like the Customs Action Plan and the report of the Wise Persons Group, which was produced last year, and the discussions on that by the Reflection Group, which was the 27 heads of customs throughout the EU. And the key objectives of that is to ensure greater uniformity in approach throughout the different member states so that trade can be more certain of what to expect. A move away from the current transactional based approach to a more systems based approach and reusing data and reusing or looking for data that's easily available to trade rather than the current model, which is very prescriptive. Do something to address e-commerce, and then obviously the green agenda is on the forefront of everyone's minds at the moment, and how we can go about either helping to reduce carbon emissions, things like that, but also a lot of these green agendas look at things like carbon border adjustment mechanism and deforestation, and customs authorities have a role to play given our unique position at the borders. So that was just a small piece from me, Will, just to set the scene. So that's the end of my presentation, and I'm sure there's some questions.
No, thank you, Celine. There's a couple of questions already coming through, but yeah, terrific to get that overview. And interesting, we moved from a transactional to a systems-based approach, something that we seem to be hearing quite a lot at the moment in the UK side as well. So that's an interesting phrase and way of putting it. But I mentioned at the start, Celine, the data from the CSA last week, which showed that exports to Ireland had increased by 55% last year compared to the year before. Which there may be some pandemic causes there, but there's also that dip of 10% month to month, December 2022 to December 2021. So to help kind of people to see wood through the trees a little bit, from your perspective, how are British companies dealing with the new customs formalities which have come in for trade with Ireland post-Brexit? And have you noticed any emerging trends in the recent months?
Yeah, what I would say is that when we were preparing for Brexit and when you were thinking about what we were trying to do, you were trying to impose customs formalities on what had been a seamless system for 30 years. So it's really difficult, a really significant change for business, and probably the biggest change in a lot of companies' times. You know, if you think about, there probably weren't that many companies now who were around when we removed all those barriers. So getting used to trading with customs formalities was really difficult. And for the vast majority of companies, they've done really well in their preparations. What we did notice was a couple of particular areas that were causing difficulties. So I think there was a misconception that if we had a trade agreement, there would be no customs formalities and no duties. Now, while there are no duties in certain circumstances, that always has to be proven. So things like returned goods relief and claiming preferential origin really rely on the sharing of information between the GB exporter and the Irish importer and vice versa. And where we've seen that difficulties really arising is in providing those proofs that are required. So one thing that could be improved on there would be in terms of the information that's required to claim those proofs and making sure that we can share that information more easily. So that's an area that could be improved. But overall, I think the vast majority of trade have adjusted really well.
Just as you're saying that, I was getting flashbacks to the stories about Percy pigs and all the issues they had back in, was it early 2021, it must have been. But we've had a really good question in from Kieran, who's actually asking, what measures do you think will help the most when it comes to improving Irish GB trade?
I'm not sure within the confines of where we have. So, I mean, the two sets of rules that we have to fit in with are the Union Customs Code, obviously, and then the terms of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So, I mean, we're not politicians, any of us on this call. So the terms of that deal and the confines that we have to operate in aren't going to change, I don't think, anytime soon. But what is there within the UCC, and I don't think it has been explored enough, is there's a whole of a host of simplifications that could be used. And I know transit is a big focus of this webinar, particularly because of the land bridge traffic. But transit can be used to move your formalities away from the port, even if you're not using the land bridge. So transit would be one area, looking at the simplifications that are available, looking at things like inward and outward processing, and they can work on both sides of the Irish Sea. And seeing really, like at the moment, people are meeting the requirements, but they're doing the bog standard customs formalities, and generally the release for free circulation, as we call it, is happening at the port. So maybe having a look into some of those other procedures and seeing what the simplifications that they give help your particular business model. I do have to caveat that though by saying, if you're in the agri-food sector, ignore everything I've just said, because all of the controls for those type of products have to be done at the port, and there'd be very little benefit from the other customs formalities that I've just mentioned.
Thank you, Celine, and I'm sure we'll come on to some of those agri-food issues later on in the Q&A, but for now, thank you. And actually, you're mentioning transit brings us nicely onto the next slide, which is actually a poll asking about transit. And at this point, I'd like to hopefully bring back Kevin. I hope that helicopter, whatever was interfering with your sound, has gone now. But Kevin, so we've got this poll here asking about the benefits of transit and what people think will most benefit their business. So I wonder if you could just talk through the options a little bit here.
Yes, thank you, and hopefully you can hear me now. Please shout if not. We've really put a few benefits down here, and I'll talk about transit in a moment a bit more, but we'd just like you to consider here. So I'll talk through some of the benefits of transit. So for example, the transit accompanying document, the TAD, being presentable in digital format, the ability to check guarantee balances online, easier handling of pre-lodged declarations, or for obviously for someone on the call, you may not be familiar with transit, you may not have used it, so please put not sure, which is a good thing because I'll be talking about transit shortly. But for those of you that use transit and aware of some of the difficulties, please select what you think are the best benefits for you. Thank you.
I'm very glad to say, Kevin, your audio was sounding very crisp and clean there, so that's that issue seems to have gone. However much you do a sound check in advance, anything can happen on a live webinar. I'll give you all just a couple more seconds to answer that poll, and I'll close the poll now. Actually, quite a revealing response as ever. Thank you everyone for answering. So 41% of you do think that the digital format of a TAD would be a benefit to your business. 18% of you saying the ability to check guarantee balance online. 31% of you use easier handling of pre-lodged declarations, and just over half of you do need to know a bit more information about transit. And Kevin, you're about to talk about transit now anyway, but the benefits of the digital format of the TAD document really coming out there as a benefit which people are already aware about, would you say?
I agree, absolutely, and I think that's one of the big benefits. But I think to refer back to a point Celine made, is that we shouldn't just see transit in relation to the land bridge, or if we're moving goods, for example, through Europe, through Switzerland, for example. There's got to be wider benefits of transit, and it's a bit like the whole element, the whole customs and trade piece, is that compliant businesses can learn more and get more benefits. Thank you.
Great stuff. Well, thank you everyone for answering that poll. And for those of you who want to know a bit more about transit, it's a good time to hand over to Kevin. It's not just about transit presentation, but you're going to give a quick update on UK Ireland trade from more the UK side. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Will. So if we have a next slide, I'm going to talk through some of the initiatives, and as always in international trade, nothing stands still. It's just such a fast-moving industry. So I'll talk about transit in the next slide, but also several other initiatives that we've seen, and these are several of many initiatives taking place, is the announcement of the UK Developing Countries Trading Scheme. So this is very much replacing the European Union Generalised Scheme of Preferences, GSP. So there's a number of elements to consider. So for example, the Institute are doing work with Nigeria currently, who probably will be one of the main beneficiaries here. But some of the concept is the concept of extended accumulation within the developing countries trading scheme, and a focus on certain sectors as well. So we will be covering more about this initiative and very much working very closely with the developing nations and LDCs who will be able to access this scheme. We've referred, or Salim referred to the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism, and I'm sure within the United Kingdom we will also have something similar in time as well. But like a lot of things, we mustn't just see this as the responsibility of the EU importer. Exporters and importers have to work together in sharing of information and being transparent in their supply chains. So this is a hugely important initiative, starting with large businesses first of all, but also moving to small businesses in time. So we'll be talking more about this, but it is quite profound, the potential implications of the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism. And continued importance of trade compliance. And again, Celine referred to this, for example, on origin. So we feel strongly compliant traders should benefit. They should benefit from being compliant, but they have to demonstrate compliance. And I've used the term before, trade compliance delivers trade advantage, trade facilitation. So certainly the likes of making sure you have all your suppliers' declarations for purposes of origin, as much information on provenance of the goods as possible, clearly correctly valuing your goods for customs purposes, and also around the commodity code as well. So there has been some confusion between GB and EU clients around is it 8 digits, is it 6 digits, is it 10 digits? So making sure we're all agreed and aligned on what the commodity code is between the importer and the exporter, knowing there is a different commodity code configuration for exports and imports. If we have the next slide, please. So transit, and again, these slides will be available to you as well as the recording. I'm just going to pick out some of the benefits here. And again, thank you for everyone for completing the poll question. Really, the point around the TAD, the transit accompanying document, being in digital format is absolutely huge. And also want to point out that if there is an incident during the goods journey, it can be reported, and the declarant can be notified in real time. So really, this leads to more simplification of trade. It facilitates trade a lot more. There is also the ability to check, the traders check their guarantee balance online. Yes, you can do that via gov.uk gateway, but effectively you can now check it through the one system. So that is also quite a big benefit. So I would ask everyone to reflect on transit. Yes, clearly in the context of the land bridge, but also the wider benefits that transit can give. And don't just think of transit as something that's really difficult to do. Think about how it can benefit your business, work with your logistics service provider as appropriate as well. If we have a next slide, please. So trade between Wales and Ireland. We all want to see legitimate trade flow freely. Yes, with enhanced use of the GB land bridge, but also with increased use of trade facilitation. So using advanced supply chain information, and Shankar will also refer to this, but being transparent in the information in your supply chain, capturing your information. Now, we talk about making sure you have proof of export, proof of import, with all the documentation in one place for each transaction. But can we increase trade facilitation further based on this advanced supply chain information? So the final point I just want to announce, and I'm pleased to announce it today on this webinar, that the Institute are working on a new training and knowledge initiative with Customs Knowledge Institute, which is based in Dublin. So we're very pleased to work with the Customs Knowledge Institute and Customs Clear in Lithuania as well, as really part of an initiative to make sure the training and information landscape is very much there for compliance for trade, not just in the United Kingdom, not just in Ireland, but the whole of the European Union as well. So some of these elements are around gaining compliance, to gain competitive advantage, to gain facilitations, is something that we're very pleased to work with the Customs Knowledge Institute. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin, and great to hear about that launch in Ireland as well, the information initiative there. Follows on nicely from our launch of IOE&IT Cymru as well, so it's very much setting up in the regions and the key trading partners too. Next slide, we're going to see that there's another poll, and I believe actually this one you will need to talk through a little bit more, Kevin, because I think you're going to be better at talking through what all of this means than I would be. So which of the below facilitations is most beneficial to legitimate trade and would best support supply chain tax transparency for you? And Kevin, do you want to talk through this question and those poll responses?
Yeah, and thank you. This very much links into what I was just saying around facilitations for businesses that operate legitimately compliant, have the history of compliance, not just AEOs, authorized economic operators, but and potentially not just businesses with authorizations, albeit we would prefer more businesses to obtain customs authorizations with the various benefits such as inward processing, as Salim referred to. So in terms of the facilitations, we've got that down here: entry into declarants records, EIDR, and using the potential there, periodic customs declarations. And I know the third one is very much linked to SBS goods, but or sanitary and phytosanitary. In this instance, looking at the concept of low risk goods, so low risk plants, for example, is reduced or no certification requirements. In this instance, it would be a phytosanitary certificate. Noting at a world level, we have a number of initiatives taking place on e-phyto currently. Or if you're not sure, please say so. But just want to test the appetite for legitimate traders that have that advanced supply chain information. Should they receive benefits, and what should they be? Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. So I'll give you all just a couple of seconds more to respond. So just to clarify then, so entry into declarant's record, that's the easement where essentially a firm can
self-declare, that's right. So effectively have the records, have the information in your own records, but upon audit you need to demonstrate you have that information.
Very good. And then periodic customs declaration, presumably that's what it says in the tin. It's doing it for a period and not for one-offs. Okay, very good. Well, I think hopefully everyone has enough information to respond. So I'm going to close the poll and share the results. And I guess not too surprising, given we're talking about a few of these things, not for the first time, but for one of the first times in this sort of context. So 38% of you saying not sure, need more information, but 35% of you saying no certification for low risk goods, which is quite interesting, has to be said. Lower numbers on EIDR and periodic customs declarations. But Kevin, any surprise there in the response? I mean, you'd expect people are still wanting to find out more about these processes, wouldn't you?
Yeah, and again, thank you everyone for responding. I think probably the 35% for no certifications for low risk goods is probably slightly higher than what I thought, bearing in mind that there may be a number of organisations on this webinar that are not involved with phytosanitary goods, plants, for example. The others interested in the 10%, I could have mentioned here, as a question, reduced data sets on customs declarations as well. So interesting, it's 28% overall, which is still reasonable, and especially as we've not really gone through these concepts in too much detail. So reasonable answers and good percentages. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you everyone for responding. But on the next slide, you will see that we are now going to move on to the next part of this webinar. So we're now going to be hearing from Shankar Singham, the CEO of Trade Law and Economic Policy Consultancy Competare. And Shankar, welcome back to the program. It's been a few months since you were last on. Am I right in saying that you actually have a new book that's about to come out as well?
I do indeed. Thank you, William. I have a book coming out on trade, competition and regulatory reform with quite an extensive treatment of customs and customs trade facilitation. And that's coming out at the end of March. unsurprisingly titled trade competition and domestic regulatory reform. So a thrilling title, and I'm sure it'll be a thrilling book for people to read.
Excellent stuff. We'll have to post a link to it as and when it is published. But over to you now to talk about central corridor improvements.
Yes, so thanks very much, William. And you've heard from Celine and you've heard from Kevin regarding the different rules that apply in Ireland as part of the EU and in the UK. And what I'm going to focus on is how piece of how we can make the central corridor more attractive. So if we go to the next slide. So I think the first thing I'd say is if you look at the if you want to call it logistically, the island of Ireland and the island of Britain, there is it's a sort of closed circuit loop that goes around both islands, carried by a lot of truck trade, roll-on, roll-off truck trade. And if one part of that circuit is not functioning properly, then all of it tends to break down. And this is actually a very, very important point now with the negotiations on the protocol going ahead, is that if there is too much of a difference between the treatment of the direct route from GB to NI versus the central corridor route, we could see problems, because 20% of the trade from Northern Ireland, between Northern Ireland and GB, actually flows across the central corridor, whether that's logistically trade flowing to or from the south of England and into Northern Ireland, or simply for weather events. So, for example, if there's a storm in the Northern Irish Sea, the trade tends to divert down to the central corridor, which is why about 20% of it is carried that way. So it is quite important that that we do attend to this issue. And the problem statement is essentially that trade has been down by about 20%. And the role of the land bridge, which is very important, particularly for Irish suppliers, Irish traders, Irish hauliers into GB and beyond into the EU, it's a very important logistical route. And this is before the UK has imposed any checks and controls on particularly the SPS controls, which were suspended and will be imposed in the course of the year in a phased, graduated way under the target operating model, which will be announced very shortly. So, you know, once you put those controls in place, you get further burdens and further restrictions and more problems. So what are the solutions? Well, Ian at the outset in his introduction talked about the role that Stena and the County Council in Anglesey are playing in the Anglesey Freeport bid. Part of a Freeport is a customs site, and I think Celine referred to inward and outward processing. If you have a customs site in a Freeport, you essentially have the potential for custom simplifications and trade facilitations there, customs warehousing, that type of thing. So there are certainly things that can happen if Anglesey is in fact determined to be a free port. And one of those things that we focus very closely on is this idea of a digital trade corridor for goods that are flowing on the central corridor. So there are many initiatives that are going forward, and I think you heard some of them discussed. Some of the European initiatives, the commitment to electronic trade, the Wise Persons Report, and this is a very, very important point. This move from transaction to systems based is quite a fundamental change, and what it will do is it will increase the emphasis on things like trusted trader schemes. You know, I know the trader, and therefore I'm more comfortable giving them certain customs and trade facilitations, including things like periodic declarations, things like EIDR and that sort of thing. Now, there are other things that you can also do. Now, some of these things would require, as Celine mentioned at the outset in her presentation, it will require conversations at the political level between the UK and the EU and the UK and Ireland in terms of trying to simplify the controls and doing some things in the regulatory area. But there are certain things that the UK has within its gift through the free port to do more trialing of things like, for example, an SPS trusted trader scheme to be part of the digital trade corridor. And what you'd want with the digital trade corridor is essentially for the trader to see effectively a bit like a portal, a bit like what traders use for the trader support service for GB&I, a portal that you put information on, and how much of that information can be drawn from the sort of normal documents you use in international trade, particularly, of course, the invoice. How much can be pulled from the invoice, and can you have a system that is able to reach out to parts of the supply chain where there is missing information, for example, especially things like commodity code, for example. Can you reach out and pull that into the system? So the feel that the trader has of filling in all of these forms is as simplified and easy as possible. So there are certain things you can do without having to get government agreement that simplifies things. And then there are certain other things where you would need a higher level of government agreement. If we go to the next slide, please. So obviously the benefits of this, and we are talking in this presentation about facilitation of trade very much. So it's not to say that compliance is not important, but in fact, the digital trade corridor could also improve compliance. So, for example, the ability, and this was referred to, I think, again in Celine's presentation, the ability to understand what is in the supply chain, the ability to provide trusted assurance to strengthen the transit system. So, for example, if I have movements from GB to Northern Ireland via the central corridor in transit, the ability to know exactly where those goods are at any one time, the ability to give intervention points for authorities where there is some reason why there should be an intervention based on risking. These are the kinds of things that a digital trade corridor with trusted assurance and with the simplification, the supply chain data management can actually deliver. We mentioned the Northern Ireland Protocol. Clearly, the protocol and the UK leaving the EU has created certain requirements that are difficult for trade, and those are being dealt with in the Northern Ireland Protocol negotiations, which are going on, even as we speak. And the question there, from the perspective of the central corridor, is just to make sure that we don't unduly distort trade, so that the central corridor it continues to function. The green agenda Celine mentioned, and that's obviously very important to both the EU and to the UK. And this is one of the reasons, actually, that the land bridge is so important. When we did the Anglesey Freeport bid, we actually looked at the effect of the land bridge on carbon emissions, and somewhat perhaps counterintuitively, because you're talking about lots of trucks going across the land bridge, the overall impact in terms of carbon emissions is about 20% less for use of the land bridge versus the direct route, Dublin to Sherborne, for example. And from a logistics standpoint, it is expensive to have to go direct and not to be able to use the land bridge. So there are significant benefits for Irish traders as well as UK traders, and also for the economies, frankly, of all three entities here, the GB, Northern Ireland, and Ireland. So I think the prize here is quite significant, and we would hope that, provided, of course, the Anglesey is given that Freeport designation, we would hope that some of these benefits could actually be deployed on the central corridor to ease the route there and bring it back as a transit, potentially a transit route also into the EU. I mean, one of the things we've talked about, Kevin mentioned this, obviously the UK leaving the EU, GB is going to be potentially a big user of transit in a way that it hasn't been in the past. And so people will have to learn those systems, and I think we'll find when they do that actually done properly and done with these facilitations, transit is a very effective way of moving your goods into continental Europe. So I'll close there, and I'm sure there will be questions.
No, many thanks, Shanker, and there will certainly be questions. But yeah, thank you. A really interesting overview. And that's just was reading actually some research which CEBR did for that bid. I think it's 21% was the carbon reduction in terms of emissions from using the GB land bridge as opposed to kind of a direct Ireland to EU route. So important stuff for many reasons, including the green agenda. If we move on to the next slide, we are going to start to move on to your questions. But I should say that Kevin has been typing away a couple of questions for me in the chat, and so I think he wants to just pick up on one thing with you, Shankar. So over to you, Kevin, first before we get into the user questions.
Yes, thank you, and sorry to be frantically texting away there. The question I was going to ask is, in relation to free ports, free trade zones, the question we get a lot at the Institute is, what lessons can UK free ports take from the likes of the World Free Zone, Safe Zone Programme, the OECD Code of Conduct for clean free trade zones? So I'm conscious there's a lot of perception out there of activity in free trade zones based on historical influences. So just welcome your view on that, Shankar.
Yeah, I mean that's a very good question, because I think if you think about free trade zones, special economic zones, whatever you want to call them, in the past, if you think about the 1970s and perhaps even 1980s, one tends to think of these sort of Wild West kind of things where no one really knows what's happening inside them. And I think customs officials, and I'm sure Celine will back me up on this, you know, they have been very skeptical and very concerned about what actually happens inside these free ports. But I think it's safe to say, and you mentioned OECD, Clean Zone, and World Free Zone Organization, Safe Zone. I mean, done properly, actually now, modern special economic zones can actually provide more data and more information and more transparency for interventions by authorities, and therefore more compliance even than the surrounding general trade. So yeah, it is important that they do that. I mean, one of my colleagues on the Anglesey Freeport bid consortium is Lars Carlson of Maersk, who is the head of trade at Maersk, but he was former head of customs at the Swedish Customs Authority, and was a director at the World Customs Organization, and he sort of explains this change of view that has occurred in the industry, for provided they have these mechanisms in place, and also things like ensuring that you know they're not the regulatory easements in the UK free ports are not used to lower you know our general labour and environmental standards.
Thank you, Shankar. I think Lars Carlson's actually been on the webinar program before as well, so it's a nice bit of the universe of IOE webinars. So we've got quite a few user questions coming through. We've unsurprisingly, we have had a few people asking about the likely impact of any deal around the Northern Ireland Protocol. So Sean asks, what is the likely impact of the red or green lane model, which is currently being discussed for the protocol on goods going across the Irish Sea? And then Lisa has also asked, what's going to happen with TSS and what could replace it if anything were to require it to be dropped or anything like that. So I don't know, Shankar, do you want to take that one first on the Northern Ireland Protocol?
Sure. So on the protocol, I would just say the thing that's important is to look at the delta between these various routes that are. So I come back to my point about, you know, from a trade perspective, I'm not talking about politics and sovereignty and so on, but from a trade perspective, you know, traders tend to use all of these different routes, you know, based on their own particular reasons. Some of that may be weather reasons, or that you don't have any control over. Some of that may be logistical reasons, but we have to make sure that that circuit is working properly. And we certainly don't want to do things, I think, that would create a very big delta between the sort of, let's say, for example, the Cairn-Ryan Belfast route versus the Holyhead Dublin route. Now, so certainly, obviously, there's going to be it is going to be different, but you want to make sure that those differences are not so extreme that you cause a major sort of dislocation. Because we have a lot of this circuit. It includes not only full trucks that we think of in trade, trucks carrying things. Empty trucks are often just as important as full trucks, and empty trucks going across these different routes are important. And you never know what may happen in the future. So you need maximum flexibility. And for example, we had avian flu outbreak recently that included the Cairn-Ryan port area. So suddenly you can't have Cairn-Ryan Belfast for some of those SPS goods that suffer in that way. So you've got to preserve the maximum flexibility you can, and so we want to make sure that everything possible is done to make sure that all of those flexibilities and facilitations that you can use under the UCC and the Transit Convention and through digitization and all of the things we talk about, trusted traders, you sort of push those out to the max. There is no one thing that you can do. There are many things, and you need to do them all. And then in response to the TSS question, so the TSS is a 2+1+1, and of course many of us here are also involved with the Trader Support Service. We are in the +1, and that expires at the end of this year, and then we will have a discussion about the final +1. I would simply say, with regard to the TSS situation, that obviously it was envisaged that the TSS would at some point reach a steady state, and then we could start talking about the exit arrangements. Now, obviously, because of the negotiations with regard to the protocol, we haven't been in steady state up to now, and we're not going to be in steady state for some time to come. And I think it's safe to say that I don't think the UK government is going to suddenly abandon, traders, particularly small traders, if the situation is still quite in flux. It would be different if we had agreed a system, January 1, 2021, and it hadn't changed at all in any way. Then perhaps there's an argument for trying to ensure that the trade and the trade support bodies in Northern Ireland in particular do step into the gap and do cover that off. But I think it would be quite unfair to sort of do that in the middle of massive change. That's certainly not a statement about the future of the TSS that is authorized in any way by anybody, either the TSS Consortium or HMRC, but that's if I were an outsider, that's the way I would look at the TSS system.
I should say that obviously there's a lot of speculation about a deal potentially being reached quite soon. The Institute will be doing a webinar at some point over the next month just to update traders on what that deal may or may not mean for traders. Indeed, coming up to the 25th anniversary of Good Friday Agreement, so it's an opportune moment to reflect on Northern Ireland trade generally. I want to move on from that though, because we have had a few other questions come through. So we've got a question here from Sylvia, who asks, if the UK introduced a single trade window, how will this align with any single window developed by the EU, or more specifically in Ireland? So Kevin, if I go to this one to you first, just in terms of the UK side of a single trade window, what are you hearing in terms of how it could align with a potential EU equivalent?
Thank you. It's a really good question and a very interesting question. I think it's important that UK, whether it's through the ecosystem of trust pilots that are currently taking place linked to the target operating model and the single trade window, is cognizance of the opportunity to have interoperability and connectivity. So you effectively, you don't create a monopoly in single trade windows, you have that interoperability. So the opportunity and the vision potentially is there for not just the UK, but for other countries, single trade windows, whether it's Australia, when it develops a single trade window, Canada and so on, that you have the ability for more digital exchange of data, but that data can also be advanced supply chain data as well. So as most people will know, the Institute have a pilot running of cut flowers, tea, coffee from Kenya to the UK, where we've demonstrated we have all the information available to HMG authorities to allow them to de-risk based on everything within the supply chain, from the commercial invoice, packing list, the master bill of lading, and actually the connection with the Kenyan single trade window, KenTrade. So I think the opportunity is there for some form of connectivity. So when we think about it in the context of the European Union and the different member states, that opportunity to have a connectivity for customs authorities to talk to each other more, but electronically, but not just the data we see today, but more advanced supply chain data that will demonstrate provenance, traceability, supplier declarations for origin, and so on. I think that's the opportunity and the potential vision that we have.
And Celine, from a customs authority in the EU, what are you seeing in terms of the potential alignment of single windows between the UK and EU?
Yeah, so kind of there is a lot of talk about single windows at the EU level as well, but I think we need to be careful about what does a single window mean in the different contexts. So the EU's single window isn't really designed to talk to a third country's customs authorities. What we're focusing on at the moment is how can we reduce the burden on trade for having to supply the same information multiple times. So the EU's single window regulation was agreed only there towards the end of last year. Ireland have been one of the member states who were participating on a pilot basis, but it's now mandatory for all 27 member states to participate. And what that does is it aims to reduce the amount of information that trade or different stakeholders in the supply chain are having to provide, and the number of authorities that they have to share it with. So I suppose the SPS one is probably the most well-known. Information is currently provided into the Certex single window, as we call it, and our system speaks directly to that. So the information that has been lodged by a trader is lodged once. They don't need to give it to us separately, and the systems speak to each other. So that's kind of how it's being approached at the moment from an EU level. I think to get to a stage where customs authorities systems from inside the EU and outside are speaking to each other might be a bit more of a challenge, but
enough.
I think if I can just add quickly on that, I think there's a sequence here that needs to be followed. So, and that's what the UK is doing with its single trade window program, which is essentially the first step is to join up government departments. So that as Celine said, tell us once. You only want to be told. Traders only want to tell the government writ large this information once. And but it's non-trivial to try to join up government departments, and it's not just about IT systems. It's also about data sharing. It's about regulatory issues. It's about, frankly, turf between different government departments. Actually, working on single windows around the world, it's turf that is usually the biggest challenge. Actually, not the IT challenge. So you've got to overcome all of those challenges, and you've got to link everything up in that way. And then you've provided an environment where a trader only has to provide the information once. Then beyond that, you have these digital corridors between single windows, which I think is where there's a lot of room for pilots. There's a lot of room for that kind of thing. And we're hopeful that we can do such a pilot on the central corridor for if Anglesey is indeed determined to be a free port, so that we can have some flexibility there, particularly with regard to what you might be able to do with SPS controls and information that you provide there. The use of the transit system as we talked about. So I think there's huge opportunities, and we're at the beginning of them. And I would point out that every single trade agreement talks about in its customs and trade facilitation chapter single window and customs facilitation. So we have been talking about this for some time, but hopefully we'll see some real progress very shortly.
Thank you, Shankar. And just for those of you who aren't too aware about the ecosystem of trust pilots, which was being mentioned just now, I've just popped a link to an article in the Times about that scheme, just in case you want to read more about it. We have time for just about one last question, and it's about actually the free ports. So it's from Owen. I'll put this to Kevin first, but Owen says the English free ports all have different sectoral emphases. Will the Welsh free ports have their own? Kevin.
I think it's probably, when we talk about England and Wales, it is that you're talking about different geographies, different regions, different history in the regions as well. So whether that's automotive, agri-food, for example, medicine. So I think what's important in free ports is for any free port to be innovative. Clean energy clearly will be absolutely essential. Access to critical minerals in supply chains will be absolutely essential as well. So we will see sectorial differences. in the free ports, but I think it's also important that free ports look at other initiatives. So to maybe to build up sectors like medicines and health, for example, more on the agricultural aspects of trade along with clean energy. So that again is the opportunity for free ports to actually widen the sectorial reach that they have.
Thank you, Kevin. And we are going to have to start wrapping up now. So I'm just going to put on the final poll as we do that. So we're just asking just to get a bit of information. Would you be willing to share more information about your supply chains if it resulted in facilitations or benefits for your business? The options being yes, because I'm a legitimate trader and I would benefit. No, you may think the information is confidential and you wouldn't want to share it. And there's an in-between option of maybe for some options, for some shipments, but not all. But at this point, I will have to say thank you very much to Ian at the start, and then Celine, Kevin, and Shankar for the presentations there. A lot of new information from many of us, I'm sure, and I hope you've found that useful. A reminder that we will be sending the slides and recording of today's webinar in the follow-up email, which you should get in the next day or so. Please do get in touch if for any reason this email doesn't come through to your main inbox. We've got a few webinars being planned for the spring, including an update on CDS in March. We're going to be doing a special session for International Women's Day about how to get more women into international trade at global level, but also in the UK, and what UK policy is trying to do to achieve that. And when it's announced, it's been trailed a bit today, but we're going to probably do a session on the UK's new target operating model, which has been very much anticipated and is due to be announced very soon. Indeed, or at least we hope it will. You can go to export.org.uk for more information on our webinars as they get announced. I'm just going to very quickly close the poll and share the responses. Thank you again for responding. So half of you say yes, you are a legitimate trader and you should benefit from that. 8% of you say no, the information is confidential, and 42% of you say maybe for some shipments, but not all. On that note, thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. As you leave, please do let us know what you thought of today's session and any suggestions for topics in future webinars. But for now, goodbye everyone, bye-bye.